everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The misnamed Arab Spring unleashed restrained passions, and like all uprisings, saw an eruption of expression in songs, music, lyrics, spreading, much like these intifadas, through social media, massive crowds, and sharing ideas and trends across borders. But just as the initial optimism of the protests was crushed by the harsh reality of reactionary governments, Western interventions, oligarchs, and capitalism, so too did the new music of an unleashed Arab youth find itself co-opted, suppressed, corrupted, and infiltrated by the West and the Gulf. Lebanese writer Mohamad-Ali Nayel has recently written a two-part series that is the definitive examination of post-Arab Spring hip-hop and popular music, and I'm very happy to have him on to talk about this and much more. Mohamad-Ali, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show, Rania.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to get into your pieces and to pick your brain about all of these various topics. But I guess a good place to start would be, how did you first get involved in what you call the Arab alternative music scene?
Well, I didn't plan to get involved. What happened was I like music. I've been DJing since before the uprisings happened. And when the uprising took place, I was hit by the visual and the sound stimuli that I was seeing on my laptop live from the protests. And that was something new that captivated my attention. From there on, there was music that was coming along the streets, and it grabbed my attention that this music was not the kind of music you would hear on the radio or people would play normally. And so I listened to the music, and I found that they were saying things that I was thinking about at the time, but it was put on music, and so it sounded nicer. It was articulated in punchlines, for example, and there was electronic element added to that music, and which also was a new addition to our Arabic sonic experience. And so it kind of, for a person like myself who grew up in the 90s listening to American rap and hip hop, and I was influenced by that. When this music came in 2011, it kind of reminded me of that music in the 90s, but it was spoken in Arabic. And so it hit me, and it was political as well. And so I picked up this music, and I started wanting to know the artists because I felt there was something in common. I'm a DJ. I used to play around Beirut, cafes and pubs and nightclubs. And I started playing this music while I play my usual stuff. And I found that people responded to it, and they associated it instantly to the streets and what was going on the street. And so that encouraged me on a personal level to play this music in public and to actually push for people to listen more to such music, because I thought there was things there that only a limited amount of people are being able to listen to, who know this kind of music, who know how to listen to rap, for example. And it should be outside the bubble, outside the niche of listeners, and it should become public. And it did, because of the uprisings. The uprisings gave a huge medium to this kind of what used to be called back then alternative music. And it gave it popularity because it spoke the sound of the street. It was able to articulate the noise that was going on the street. And in my opinion, and I feel like there was a lack of leftist music production during that time. And there is still this type of lack, because during the 80s, for example, and the 70s, there was a huge leftist production of street music, or of music that is political or militant per se, music that doesn't necessarily sing about love or romantic, sensual relationships, but music that spoke about true causes, about struggles, about the human condition, and so on. And this music stopped being produced after the 90s, or completely disappeared. It was reproduced by new artists that repeated the same experience of the 80s without adding new aesthetics to it. And so it remained like a sentimentality, a nostalgic sound for a certain generation that lived during those times. And to me, as a kid, I grew up in Beirut during the Civil War, listening to this leftist music. And so whenever it's played in my imagination, it's associated with the Civil War.
I see.
So in 2011, new music genres came out and filled that gap that was left by leftist music production. And I was hungry for that expression because it came aesthetically reflecting the type of music we grew up listening to and so on.
Yeah. And I mean, just to be clear here, when you talk about this kind of music that you're describing, it's like, are we talking about like a hip hop style, a rap style of music? You mentioned electronic, or is it a mix of all of those things?
So in 2011, there was all kinds of creations. Arabic rap became the loudest, and maharaganat music in Egypt also became the loudest because in rap, for example, there's a space to say whatever you want, to rap about everything. There's a space in the track over the music to say anything, literally. And so some Arab rappers were able to sing the sound of the street, and so rap took recognition from then on. There was also the fact that on the other side, rap was fetishized as a neoliberal, rap was fetishized as a new orientalist representation of Arab youth by foreign journalists or foreign NGOs or the West in general. And we can speak about this later.
Yeah. And, just obviously like the launching off point for this conversation, like I mentioned in the introduction, is these two very lengthy pieces and detailed pieces that you wrote for Jadalia, which I will link to in the description so people can go check them out. But can you maybe summarize the main thesis of your pieces? Because it's definitely about more than just music.
Yeah, of course. So the story started back in December. I was chatting to Bassam Haddad about music and politics, and we were emphasizing how much music and politics are so intertwined. And it's usually people tell you, when you say there's politics in music, people say, "Oh no, what you're talking about, music has nothing to do with politics." And in my opinion, as a DJ and a person who's a listener and passionate about music, I think politics is in music all the time. And so when we speak about music that is subversive or calls itself conscious music, then politics become its main engine, per se. And so I decided to write a long analysis that starts at 2011, when these new genres came out on the wave of the Arab uprisings. And I followed with a timeline of 10 years up to 2021 of how these creations and these artists have moved through the wave of changes that have went through the last 10 years. And where music started 10 years or 11 years ago is very different from where it is now. We're speaking about what used to be called the alternative music scene. And because I was involved with these creations as a DJ, as a journalist, I lived in the scene. I saw it, and I saw how it came together at some point, and it spoke about causes across the Arab world in general. It spoke a youth from one country spoke to another youth through music and so on, and it created connections. And then there was a moment that it went to the opposite of that. It started fragmenting, it started turning into individualism. And for instance, when an artist in 2011 saw a need to create music and rap about what was going on, he did it, or she did it from a necessity and not from, let's say, a creative impulse. They did it from necessity. By 2016, the same people start becoming professionals. Like, now, what do you do for a living? I'm a rapper, for instance. This category did not exist before then, before the uprisings. Like, it was very rare to find some artist or someone that says, I'm a rapper for a living. In the Arab world, for example.
Yeah.
But then it became a model after 2015, 2016. And good for them, they established themselves. They became a thing in their own. And so I always think, before I wrote that piece, I always think about those last 10 years from the Arab uprisings until 2021 and how things drastically changed in those 10 years in terms of Arab political reality. We started from a point where we suddenly realized that, oh my God, we speak the same language. We are literally the same people. We have the same family names in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, in Algeria, in Morocco. It's the same last names. It's the same family names. We eat the same food. We celebrate the same festivals, the same Eid. And suddenly we realized that those nationalist post-colonial identities showed their limitations. For a person in Lebanon, I was like, why Lebanon define my geohistoric personality, reality? Why am I just a subject that has to be contained in this geographical space that was created just like 70 years ago, 75 years ago? And so it kind of hit us. And the internet made it easier to connect and see live how our peers, our brothers and sisters in other Arab localities 2 hours away from us were rebelling and were on the streets speaking not about particular small causes, but they were speaking universal Arab causes and so on. So it was a moment of reckoning in that regard for a youth like myself to realize that, oh snap, I'm not just Lebanese. My identity is actually all the way in this region, and I've been contained here for the last 70 years and so on. And so that's why I felt like that I want to understand what happened in those 11 years. And so the only way to understand it is sit down and write and research and write and so on. And I came up with a huge piece, but I felt like I couldn't stop, I feel like if I wanted, I could continue writing, but
it looks like it could be turned into some sort of book, honestly. And it really does. I mean, it is really cool how you sort of like thread together the entire narrative of like the past 11 years or so of this music and how it aligns with the political changes across the region from 2011 to now. And we're going to get into all of that. But you mentioned it, you alluded to it earlier, and you do talk about it in your piece, this framework of neoliberal orientalism, creating this kind of like fantasy about the Arab rapper. You specifically cited this person, Rania Al-Zain, saying that the Western mainstream media are, quote, eager to imagine Arab youth in non-threatening modes of resistance that are directly related to American culture. So I'm curious if you can maybe like break down what that means and elaborate a bit.
Yeah, of course. So on that question, let's go back to the moment when the streets exploded. There was a moment of shock amongst Western journalists and foreign policy researchers in the region. And I used to work as a fixer. And so I saw it. I saw when they were shocked about what was happening. A lot of them start calling it, oh, it's an Arab awakening, as if we were sleeping for the last 80 years and we just woken up. And no one was able to see it as a progression, as an accumulation of events and as an accumulation of disasters that have maxed out, and so it exploded on the streets. So when they saw a huge sea of young people acting politically, they didn't know what to do with this phenomena that they didn't see coming. And so the rapper became an easy figure to sum up the whole situation, to project it and present it to a Western audience. Like Raya Zain mentioned in my podcast interview I did with her, that too many news editors, the rapper was an easy handle to figure out what was going on in the region. Because to Western, especially American news outlets, the Arab rapper was perceived from a whitewashed American history about civil rights and the raps that came after it, and how the world became a better place because of that, and so on. So yes, it's about reducing a whole socio-political reality to the persona that could be understood through its equivalent in Western culture. In this case, the rapper is a familiar persona that gets framed as the event itself. They are
Yeah.
rappers. They speak truth to power. They use beats. We understand those beats. They are subversive and they are non-violent, at least to the eye of the non-Arabic speaking journalists. That's the thing. Those journalists, those people who wrote about rap and fetishize it, don't understand what the rapper is talking about, but they see him as a persona that they understood well. So by using the rapper, for example, as a medium for representing one people's political struggle to a Western audience, then you don't have to explain how Western foreign policy is actually involved and entrenched in the socio-political dynamics that govern these Arab localities. The rapper or artist or musician are presented as youth who use tools of entertainment known and created in the West. Mm-hmm. And because the focus of neo-orientalism is about the fetishization of the non-violent political protester in the Arab world. It says, look, even if we don't speak the language, we understand you through political frames that we know how to frame you through, and it's frames that we gave you in the first place. In this regards, Raya Zen says it's an understanding through blackwashing the Arab youth. In that sense, so rap was picked up as a new and fetishized as a new Orientalist phenomena because of its, in my opinion, it's racialized association. During the Arab uprising, there was all sorts of artistic creations, but rap was picked up by Western journalists because of that racialized association.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
it's a handle, you know. The editors can pick up this handle and explain it to the Western audience without having to understand what the rapper is actually talking about. It's like, ironically, the same handle a few years later was changed by Western journalists and editors, and suddenly there was articles start popping up about jihadi rap that was used to recruit people to ISIS. It's a phenomenon that only existed. It's a phenomenon that only existed in these articles. I don't know or recall a jihadi rap that was made to recruit people for ISIS.
Yeah, I don't think ISIS does music, right? Like, exactly. I think they do like the prayers, and like they'll do that like in sort of an a cappella style kind of way, but they don't really do. That's actually really funny. So I want to go back to something that you also alluded to, which is this sort of like Pan-Arabism that this provoked during the Arab uprisings. You note this resurgence specifically in Pan-Arabism through this question of Arab identity, like you were talking about earlier, where rap was helping to lead to this kind of like cultural exchange across countries. Like you mentioned, where people like, and then people notice, oh, like we actually have a lot in common. We're kind of the same people, and these are artificial borders. Can you maybe give some examples of this, and how come, and also more importantly, like this was sort of short-lived? Why did that not last?
Of course. So when the Arab uprising exploded, like I said before, the internet was the space that bypassed the borders, and so people found themselves on internet, on social media platforms, and so on. When that happened, suddenly there was an instinctive urge for volunteering, and volunteering is a very cultural thing to us. You know, we are not individualist communities or societies. We are collectivist societies, historically speaking, and so the spirit of volunteering is within the culture for a long time. For example, the Palestinian martyr, intellectual Basil Araj, explained this phenomena by songs that used to be made 200 years ago and so on, between peasants, that encourage the spirit of volunteering. When one peasant wanted to cultivate his olive harvest, there was a song that people used to sing. It says "Ala dal'auna," which means let's lend the hand of assistance. So it's about volunteering. The whole village came and helped this person to cultivate his trees. When one person wanted to build a house, the whole village came and volunteered to do that. And so the communal volunteering.
Okay, spirit, is that why that song like doesn't end?
Ala dal'auna?
Yeah, it just goes on and on
exactly.
and on.
Because it's a peasant song in the field. It's a whole day song.
I actually didn't know that. I did not know that. Anyways, continue.
Yeah, and when I learned from the Murder Basil Araj about the specificity of this song, it made sense to me because I've heard this song since I was little, and I've heard
Right.
it in the mountains, in localities where people still lived with the land, and it made sense
Mhm.
to them. So to go back to the Arab uprisings, that the uprisings kind of opened up the volunteering instinct in us, where people, for instance, from different countries felt that they could contribute to their brothers and sisters in other countries. And so people start sharing what they were creating in the squares of protests. Other people learned in other localities how to, for instance, set up a tent, how to set up a live projection in the street and show people films about what was going on. And so that was exchanged like a copycat effect. And people were creating these tools of knowledge to enable themselves and to share it with other people and enable them to expand their political expression and political activism. And so people creativity was not motivated by funding from NGOs or by money or by personal fame, for instance. It was motivated by the urge to help someone else, or the urge to actually help ourselves and organize our community and start to articulate a sort of politics that could represent the street. And so in that sense, there was a movement of Arab rap that so obviously came on the wave of protests. The rappers in this movement, they all were concerned about what was going on in the street, and through collaboration from one country to another, they created a sort of atmosphere, or let's say a sort of lyrical representation that summed up that spirit of volunteering, cooperation, and common political causes that bypassed
Mm.
borders and geographical localities. And this culminated in a collaboration of an initiative called Khat Talit, which means the third line. Um, it died out quickly because obviously there was no space after that for a third line of politics.
Mm.
Things were polarized, and so that third line that was trying to show that we are not with this side or that side, we are in the middle, did not live. But its symbolism was very interesting because it came from the idea of a track railway that used to connect Arab countries that went all the way to Hijaz, and people use it to go to Hajj. And so it played
Mhm.
on that metaphor that not a long time ago we were all connected by railway, and we all passed through each other's localities and so on. And so in Beirut, the initiative was finally gave a fruit of an album and a live concert. And it was a very fun night, honestly. I was there, and to be there and to listen to different causes being rapped in different Arab accents was really a treat, because especially at that moment, when we listened to rappers from Aljazair rapping in from Tunisia rapping in Beirut, their accents, what they flowed about, was so gravitating, and it felt so near. Although in our imagination, Tunisia feels so far, but then this collaboration kind of brought together the value of the Arab language as well, and people realized that there's so much more to our Arab language that we are not using in our daily use, and that variety of accents and the use of different words in different localities was also interesting in a way that it opened people's perceptions about other people's realities and so on. And again, it made us feel that what is in common between us is much more than the borders that divide us. After the concert and after that collaboration, unfortunately, it did not get repeated. And by that time, it was 2014, the coup in Egypt. Things became really grim, and so that the Egyptian withdrawal of the scene of the Arabic rap was also effective, because Egypt is really big in the Arabic entertainment scene in general,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
music and
Always
culture.
has been, right?
Always has been. It's a powerhouse. and its symbolism historically coming from Egypt. Kulthum, when she sang about today I have a rifle, about the Palestinian resistance, it was huge. The whole Arab world exploded. And so that symbolism is historical from Egypt. So when Egypt was withdrawn from the equation of the Arab uprisings and the civil war in Syria was getting to a brutal stage, the situation became grim. And collaborations kind of started becoming more into one-to-one artists, and it stopped becoming of a collectivist kind of thing. Unfortunately, in Egypt, all the rappers that came out from Egypt on the wave of uprisings went completely quiet. A lot of them left the countries. A lot of artists, the ones who stayed in Egypt, were coerced to make music that sang the prose of the regime. It was brutal. And up until now, you know, the entertainment situation and music production in Egypt is scary because people cannot speak anything political whatsoever, even if it's a satire, even if it's anything. The regime is so brutally just arresting people, cracking down on them. And so they're still producing music, but their content is, I mean, to me personally, is not a thing that I would listen to today. It's extremely commercialized.
Yeah. You know, and I would also imagine that, you know, at some point, a lot of these different places, well, of course, there's so many commonalities, various uprisings came in contradiction to one another, right? Like if you're pro-Syrian uprising and it's the year 2013 or 2014, but you're also extremely pro-Palestine and pro-resistance across the region, that's a huge contradiction, right? Because that opposition was like in line, you know, being, you know, it was collaborating with the Americans, with the Qataris, with the Saudis, against, you know, what would be considered the resistance. And that was like a huge, you know, fault line for a lot of people when it came to like the sort of crashing down of this idea of like a regional uprising. And then of course with Egypt too, I mean, that was probably even a bigger contradiction, especially once Egypt's out of the scene. But I imagine then of course with, I don't know how involved, you didn't really mention in your pieces anything about Libya. So I don't know if there was any like music production coming out of Libya at the time, but that was also a huge contradiction, right? Because Libya was destroyed by this like NATO regime change operation. And we can get into all that stuff and the way that sort of like the Western intervention played a role in the evolution of some of this music. But you kind of alluded to this as well, which is this class element. Breaking down the divide, right? Like you mentioned in your piece the importance of like cheap Chinese computers and access to the internet, allowing accessibility to this music beyond just that sort of upper middle class group of people who have the purchasing power. So how important was that in the sort of like, I don't know, ability of like all classes to participate?
It was very important, especially from a working class perspective. I'm going to break it down this way. So from a personal experience, I've always loved music since I was little. But to me, and the circumstances I grew up in a working class family, music always felt like something rich kids did, that rich families were able to enroll their kids to learn how to play music and so on. So it was something that I didn't think about as an option because, you know, the economic situation of my family when I was a kid did not allow me to contemplate such luxuries. And so I left school at a young age. I was 14 and I still loved music. And the first thing I did when I worked and got paid is I bought a double deck cassette stereo, and I started DJing with the two cassettes. This is how I started DJing at home and recording cassettes, recording music from the radio and so on. And so, yes, until recently or until 2010, let's say, it was still the case where to make music, you had to be from a privileged background where you could just do that and not have to worry about working and making a living. And so when the uprising happened, suddenly when people start sharing tips about creating music, digital music, the access to knowledge and the access to music became very feasible to anyone. it was no longer about your socioeconomic privilege. It was about, if you are into this and if you are into learning, knowledge exists. So it's up to you to chase your creativity in that sense. And so it also coincided with the fact that there was cheaper laptops in the market. Like I bought a brand new laptop back then for $200.
Whoa.
And yeah, and that was huge because also like that was the first time I buy a new laptop, for instance. And a lot of friends around me too, in that time, we used to buy used computers or used laptops because laptops and computers were really expensive. And so by the entrance of these cheap technologies that function as good as other technologies, it became easier for anyone literally to just create audiovisual production. And so from then on, internet, social media, music programs, pirated music programs, tips from artists were exchanged on social media and so on. It encouraged everyone, or encouraged whoever had an impulse of creativity in them to actually go and do something and not just think that it's economically inaccessible to me, or it's not my priority at the moment. I need to focus on making a living. And so
yeah, that makes sense.
That was really something that opened up the door to a lot of people to create. And you can see that in Egypt, for example, in the mahraganat music. It's picked up by ear musicians. It's a music that's composed by ear musicians, and it comes from the poorest localities of Egypt. It's the poorest neighborhoods that create mahraganat music, and it's created from necessity.
Yeah,
because they need to create their own genre.
Right. You also write that, and this is kind of, I guess, going back to some of the more controversial aspects of the Arab uprisings. You write that by the end of 2013, a sentiment of resignation was provoked by the realization that politically charged music could not materialize organized politics. So could you maybe talk about, how the failures of some of the uprisings, including like the eruption of civil war in places like Syria, and then also the NGO-ization and sort of like emptying of the streets, how it impacted this alternative music scene? And I think that Lebanon is kind of a perfect example of the NGO-ization aspect of this.
Of course. So like you mentioned earlier, the military intervention in Libya, it was the first nail that cracked the naivety as well that was, and the enthusiasm that was, let's say, coating our perceptions about what was going on in the streets. So for a young person, also that explosion of politicization, at first it looked like what seemed impossible happened, and so we were taken by the shock of the moment. And for the moment, no one thought that what's next, what's after the actual toppling of a head of state, what comes next after that. So for a lot of people, it felt like once you topple a head of state, khalas, you won. It's
done,
over.
yeah.
Go back home, things get better. We found out that it's not the case. And Libya, the intervention in Libya, and how Hillary Clinton brutally destroyed what was going on there, or intervened, destroyed our naivety. And from then on, the coup in Egypt came and actually cemented that feeling of that there are bigger forces in control of politics, and a protest that could topple a head of state doesn't mean that the revolution won, doesn't mean that things are going to change. Things changed for the worse, obviously, after that. And so that affected the cultural musical creation when the streets were empty, and when, as Western journalists start saying, there was a reporting fatigue, a news fatigue. When the naivety was broken, and when, after the coup in Egypt, a sense of depression started settling amongst a lot of people. In Lebanon, the case was that Lebanon did not see an Arab uprising coming through it. There was bit of protest that was disastrous, but it didn't. The Arab uprising did not come to Lebanon in 2011, 2012. On the contrary, Lebanon benefited from the wave of uprisings, actually, in many ways. But what happened is that NGOs in Lebanon started opening with the entry of Syrian refugees. There was more NGOs opening, and so there was new money coming in. And so when Syrian refugees came to Lebanon, and some Syrian rappers came to Lebanon and found a refuge amongst some Lebanese rappers, they created a vibe around them. They created an atmosphere. They were still making music about what they experienced before they fled Syria and so on. They were still politicized. Their experience in Beirut obviously shocked them because Beirut is a brutal city. There was this class divide between the Syrians themselves. There were the Syrian refugees who lived in tents, and there was the Syrian artists who came from a better socio-political situation, and so they didn't have to live in tents. And so when that happened, cultural NGOs in Beirut, who are run by elites, by liberal elites, so that they have a fetish for these subversive talents, for these people who just came out from the battle zone and so on, from the protest zone and so on. And they kind of sponsored that creation. And these artists, they kept performing in Beirut and so on, and they created like a subculture around them. And from then on, we start seeing, I started noticing a change of the audience. For example, in the beginning, people went to the concert just wanting to hear the punchline that said the people want the downfall of the regime, and they wanted to shout that. It felt like a protest. Later on, the rap concerts start feeling like a niche situation where you found the cultural elites in the country, the daughters and sons of the richest people were in these concerts. And the fact that they now listen to Arabic music on electronic beats, and it's an Arabic lyrics that speaks about causes and more and more in a human rights discourse way, in a middle class petit bourgeois concerned way. They kind of picked up on this, and they did support those creations generously and handsomely, and good for the rappers because life in Beirut is tough. Also, the success of Syrian artists in Lebanon created a sort of chauvinism in Lebanon. Lebanese artists start feeling jealous from the success of Syrian artists, and so Syrian artists
they're taking our jobs.
I know. They start getting banned from playing in cafes and small pubs and so on. And so, yes.
That's pathetic. And you mentioned this too. I like that you talk a lot in the piece about how the upper class co-ops the subversive aesthetic, and of course this ends up impacting the political message. But since we're on the subject of Lebanon, I wanted to ask you about how these changes that you're talking about were reflected in the sort of music that defined the period of Lebanon's "You Stink" protests, the trash protests, which took place in 2015. Versus what you saw in 2011. And this kind of, I think, speaks to the NGO-ization, because those protests were very much quickly, taken over by the sort of NGO-style leaders, Western-funded NGO-style leaders. So how did that impact the sort of music that was being produced around that time?
So it's interesting that you mentioned the NGO-ization in 2011. It's true that in 2015, when the protests in Beirut happened, the protest started from a class element, from a pure class element. When the middle upper class intelligentsia who spent their nights in bars in Hamra or on private beaches saw that the trash was encircling them, it became so close to the tables they were sipping their cocktails on. They were like, we have to do something. Now we're smelling the trash. Although in poor neighborhoods, people live smelling the trash. Trash been piling in streets for a long time. And so they created an NGO. They registered it. They got funding to it. And they started a protest. And they started protesting in downtown Beirut. There were first 20 protesters calling for recycling. That's how it started. And so trash accumulated, and the more it accumulated, it was summer. Poor neighborhoods start coming out, and there was 2 months of protests in the streets in Beirut. But during that time, also the Syrian artists who were in Beirut, with the Lebanese artists, the rappers, they instantly responded to this wave of protests that happened, and they created a few tracks that was able to form as an aesthetic accompaniment to the people on the streets. For instance, I saw something that made me think, I still think about it till today, where there was like few individuals shouting at a policeman the lyrics of a rap song that was created around that time by Lebanese artists. And so it made me think that this attests to the fact that there is a lack of creation of militant music that the leftists used to do back in the days that spoke about people's causes. And because of that lack, rap came and filled up this space. And on the streets, obviously, there was a need by protesters to express their anger in articulated sense. And all they could think about is these rap lyrics they heard from this rapper from Baalbek. And they shouted it at the policeman. But these were individual cases. One song, for example, Hayya ala Khair al-Shagab, made it big, and people start playing it in a protest, people start singing it and like writing the lyrics on the walls and so on with graffitis. But it also stayed in that middle upper class circle of activists and NGOs. And so the whole thing fed on each other. And obviously, when the weather got colder, and after 2 months of just protesting without a proper plan for what does this mean and where it could go, and by the fact that it was run by NGOs personalities who saw it as a medium to launch their political careers, because we saw 2 months later from those protests, the same activists running for municipal elections. So in a sense, a lot of people thought that these protests worked as a portfolio build-up for these activists to actually get involved into politics and so on. And it was a feature that kind of governed the whole protest movement. When people were organizing for direct actions, you suddenly realize that this activist or that activist actually had their own personal plans, their own personal short-term interest, and they were trying to filter everything that was going on through that. And that happened a lot. And it attests to the situation in Lebanon, where Lebanon is a very divided society. Reality changed from one street to another. And so, unfortunately, in situations where people get together to organize for a bigger cause, they get fragmented by short-term personal interest and so on. And so in that regard, yes, in 2015, music as rap, as conscious music or whatever, came for the moment, and it was able to express something. But the same people who were doing this split out after that. They all split off. They became ones and individuals. And so people saw that, the listeners who were inspired by these artists saw on social media how they butchered each other for small personal issues. And that was not an encouraging example to lead by for those who saw those personalities as role model, let's say, because of what these personalities spoke about or rapped about.
Yeah, and you do talk about the sort of splits and the impact that had, particularly by the time it was 2016. You also had a lot of people leaving the region, going to Europe, and then of course with the issues of nihilism and individualism and monetization and commodification. Like, you also give examples of how by 2016, so many of these alternative musicians were into this individualistic kind of self-empowerment, which was, of course, which is also easier to monetize in the music industry. And I guess, isn't this kind of like the allure of the entertainment industry, like the way that capitalism co-ops subversive aesthetics, and this is kind of universal, and turns it into something powerless. And of course here, this is similar to what we've seen in the United States with hip hop, which did, of course, go from this focus on the streets with the politics mixed in to now what you mostly see, especially, with the bigger artists, is this kind of glorification of consumption and also individualism.
Of course, I think the way the game is played today is not the way it used to be played in 2011 for these people who came out and spoke about collectivist causes. Today, money and the fear of getting cancelled works a lot in the way the artist becomes motivated. The entry of monetary income through streaming have encouraged the split of rappers into ones, because now, as an individualist rapper who has a huge social media following, gets fan gratification from and abundant validations from their social media followings, and they can make an income through streaming. They feel that they have become a persona in their own, and so what motivated them in the first place and what brought them to the public is no longer what makes them function today. Basically, today they are just worried about protecting what they have gained so far, and so that element plays a lot on the creation they do.
Yeah. And then I want to move to the issue of Syria, because like you had experience in Syria. You were in Syria in 2011 reporting on the uprising. I know you were also a fixer. And then you also later went to Yemen as well. So I'm curious if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how what you witnessed. Well, okay, explain what you witnessed versus how it was portrayed both in Arab and English media, because I know those two things were very different.
Of course. Well, beginning when I went to Syria to start with, in the summer of 2011, things have taken political lines in terms of representation. And so, funny, we were sitting in a hotel room watching Al Jazeera Arabic, and they were saying there were protests in certain areas around Damascus. So we hopped in a taxi to go to those areas. We get to those areas, and we find that life was completely normal. We asked around if there was a protest, and people said, no, there hasn't been a protest so far today. We may be planning for Friday, but at the moment, there's nothing happening. Maybe in somewhere else around us, there was a protest earlier, but in here, nothing happened. And so that was the first sign for me to pick up on how things were represented outside of what was going on. And so that's why I went to Syria, because I started feeling while in Beirut that Beirut is very close to Syria. It's 2 hours away. It's not like a separate world, and we are connected in many aspects. Lebanon is part of Syria anyway. And so I felt like there was things that are being filtered coming out from Syria that I felt like I needed to see for myself what was going on. I lived in Syria when I was little. We lived in Homs for a few years, and so I'm familiar with Syria. And so when I went there, and we went from Damascus to Homs, and saw for myself what was happening, it was significant in Homs also that in the Alawite areas, there was a different perception about what was going on, and in Sunni areas, there was another perception. And I have started feeling that there is a sectarian element growing between those areas that was very similar to what I know from Lebanon. And so, and so that opened my eye about what was going on like a direct level on the street and so on, and in opposition to how it was reported in foreign media. And that continued also when I came back from Syria and I was in Beirut working as a fixer with foreign journalists. I started hooking up Syrian friends who came to Lebanon with foreign journalists as well to work as fixers and so on, because they are Syrian, and all the foreign journalists in Lebanon suddenly turned their attention to Syria. And so I saw a few incidents where stories were made up by fixers and foreign journalists instigated without actually a moment of interrogation. And because that was the vibe, anything a Syrian person said was taken as fact value. And the Syrian fixers knew what these foreign journalists wanted to eat. And so they fed them these stories because they wanted to make a living. In my opinion, it's not the fault of the fixer, it's the fault of the unexperienced foreigner that came to a different country to report its reality. And it's this type of knowledge creation that creates so much mistruths and so much misrepresentations. And actually, it's a form of disinformation, in my opinion, because you are responsible for creating knowledge that people will consume in a different part of the world. And so if you don't speak the language and don't understand the culture, and you felt bored in London or New York and decided to have a change of life and came to Lebanon, and start reporting on Syrian refugees just because you can, it doesn't mean that you are doing your job as you're supposed to. And you can't blame the fixer for the accuracy of your story. In the end, the fixer is an invisible link in the story creation. All the credit goes to the person, to the foreign journalist who created the story and so on. And so I saw a lot of this kind of misrepresentation and fetishization of the Syrian activists in Beirut, where it didn't really reflect the reality. It was completely framed in a certain liberal sense that fitted the foreign policy of these countries. Right. When I went to Yemen in 2012, I also tell you the truth, it was again, as an Arab youth, I was discovering that part of the Arab world that people in Lebanon, for instance, or Syria in general, maybe Lebanon more, don't look back to that part. We always look to the West. We're always looking to Europe in that direction. We don't look to our hinterland that much. And so when I went to Yemen, I was so heartened by the experience that was there, the mode of protest that the Yemenis were using, and the kind of Yemeni politics that was completely absent from my reality in Lebanon. It opened my eyes as well on the Yemeni youth. And also it opened my eyes on the Saudi hegemony that actually affects Yemeni politics and so on. And to go back again to the beginning, where in Yemen, for instance, there was artistic creations that was not a sort that the foreign journalist or editor could understand. It was just artistic creation that were completely local and authentic in a way. And it was singing about the revolution. It was singing about the struggle on the street. It was representing that, but it didn't get picked up. Again, in 2015, when the war on Yemen started, Ansar Allah brought back a genre in Yemen. It's called zawamil, plural of zamil, which is a type of traditional Yemeni poetry that doesn't exceed 2 meters. And so they recomposed it with electronic elements. And now it's the soundtrack of the front, basically. You see videos, Yemeni fighters playing that music when they are running with Kalashnikovs or when they are fighting and so on. And so it's a local element that was brought back, and now it's the tune of these fighters, of the Yemeni fighter and so on. And that's something doesn't get picked up by liberal cultural NGOs. For instance, you are in Beirut, and I'm pretty sure you know that there are cultural NGOs that are throwing massive parties at the moment, while there's no medicine, no electricity, no water. There's literally nothing in Beirut, 78% below poverty line. But for some reason, cultural NGOs still have money to throw massive parties and call it subversive talents in the name of the street. I mean, the amount of hypocrisy is ridiculous in this regard. And it actually speaks the truth about these cultural NGOs that are funded from the outside, because their existence and their work is subject to their funding from its non-funding, basically. From foreign funding, is it existing or not? And that stays in a small socioeconomic circle. It gets consumed by those who have the privilege and purchase power to be able to enjoy it and consume it and so on.
No, that's very well said. And I wanted to ask you, you also go in your part 2 of your piece, you talk a bit about Arab militant music. So I'm curious if you could explain, what do you mean by that, and why is it so important to resistance across the region, from Palestine to Iraq to Yemen?
Of course. Well, the person that opened my eye on this concept is the person behind me, Ghassan Kanafani. Ghassan Kanafani once wrote about militant journalism, and that's the type of journalism he used to do, and the type of fiction writing he used to do. He described it as militant writing or committed writing, in a sense where, as I described militant music, it's a creation, it's an artistic creation that is created specifically for a cause, for a direct militant cause, for a cause that people are fighting and losing their lives for, and so on. And this music Palestine is the place of creation. In the last 100 years, the Palestinians have created militant music that were sung on the fronts when people were men and women were fighting the Zionist gangs or the British occupation and colonization and so on. There were songs that were made particularly to keep up the morale on the front. And that's why I call it militant music. In Yemen, the Zawamil music I just spoke about, it is another form of militant music because it's the kind of music that keeps the morale of the fighter up. It even sings about historical periods where, for instance, one Yemeni Zawamil song speaks about how says, go ask the Romans, the Ottomans, and the British how they all tried to conquer us and failed. And so it's a music that is curated for the front. It's not music that it's curated for sentimentality or for soft causes. It's hardcore music.
That is true if you hear it. And then I'm curious, specific to Palestine, how and why is Palestinian rap music different from the rest of the region?
Well, Palestinian rap music has always sounded different from the rest of the region because of the fact of occupation, because there is a need to express the reality that a person living under occupation goes through. And because in Palestine, there was this one artist, this one group called Them, and I think you interviewed one of the artists recently, Tamer Naffar.
Yeah.
They came up with this song Mina Rahabi that was so powerful that it created an example for people to copy and follow. And that was also taken up by a group called Ramallah Underground, which took the experience of Mina Rahabi and it expanded the articulation of the daily experience of Palestinian youth living in Palestine. And when it composed its tracks and beats, it relied on sampling classic Arabic sounds that was familiar to the listener. But what they rapped about was directly related to the life they lived under occupation. And to a person that was in Beirut, listening to these people, I was learning about the occupation in a very different sense from how the news framed reality in Palestine. I was directly learning how young people in Palestine, young men like myself, lived every day on the street. What did they encounter? What was their worries, their daily worries, and so on. And because it was founded on these bases in Palestine as an expression defying the brutal force of occupation, it gained respect from the street. People on the street in Palestine recognized that creation because it didn't sound condescending, it wasn't preachy, and it didn't come out of place. It was completely organic. And so today, for example, this tradition have continued with a new generation of Palestinian rappers who are influenced completely by local rappers. Their influence did not come from the West. It came from them. It came from Ramallah Underground. And that's genius in itself. When you listen to it today, and you listen to it 10 years ago, you see how today it managed to coin a sonic element for itself that's completely organic, and it's not trying to copy paste the music of trap and rap that is coming from America. Like in Egypt, for example, most of the time, I'm not going to generalize, but it's a copy paste formula from big artists coming from Atlanta. In Palestine, it's different. In Palestine, you can feel the local element completely embedded in the track and the music production. And the things the rappers are talking about there is completely related to their reality. Also, the fact that they don't pretend to be an end in itself. Like rappers in Palestine don't say we are the resistance, or we can replace the militant resistance. The militant resistance is the militant resistance. That's the resistance. But what they are doing is they are expressing their daily lives. They are expressing what is going on in there. And they have got to a level that is also musically really good. It's really creative. And so I think it's a success in a sense where it's created by local elements and local cooks and influenced by local reality. That's why it's different from other raps in other Arab localities. In other Arab localities, you're always finding that it's a copycat or influenced strongly by American tracks we know, of course.
Yeah. And that brings me to, the issue of normalization, right? So you talk a lot about this in the part 2 of your series, how has normalization with Israel impacted the Arab rap scene? Has Israel tried to use rap in a way to push normalization schemes? And then where does Saudi Arabia fit into that? You specifically talk about the role of Warner Music Group Middle East, if you want to maybe use that as an example here.
Of course. I don't think Israel used rap for normalization. Actually, I don't think rap succeeded in Israel in a way. I mean, I don't know if there was rap that came out from an apartheid or from a colonialist state. What is it going to rap about? The fact that they are racist, the fact that they are colonizing someone else. And so, in this sense, the rap that came from Palestine was extremely against Israel in that sense. And so, the raps that are coming out at the moment, I don't say that Israel co-opted rap. I don't think so. But I would say that big music are trying to co-opt rappers and trying to dull down their creation by luring them into the idea of being signed with a big record like Warner Music Group and getting this exposure of fame and money and so on. And I think, in my opinion, when artists become co-opted by such big music entertainment, they become tamed in a sense. They become contained, for instance. With the role of Warner Music Group in the region, we see that big entertainment, other big entertainment like Warner Music, entered the region in 2018 just with the wave of normalization that was being fanned by Jared Kushner and Donald Trump and Netanyahu with the Gulf states, with MBS, with Bahrain and Emirates, and so on. And so suddenly we see this big music entertainment companies opening up in the Gulf, and they start sponsoring shows that promoted the openness of MBS. See, the thing about the openness that MBS is promoting is one way to actually erase Palestine from memory and from people's consciousness. For instance, take an example. MBC is a television network in the Arab world that is owned by Saudi Arabia. They used to show the famous Palestinian series called the Taghrib al-Falastini. It's an Arabic series that speaks about the Nakba that befell the Palestinians when their land was occupied and scared by Hatem Ali. It's a huge show. It's really one of the best Arabic series about the Palestinian situation and the Palestinian refugee situation and so on. They removed it completely. They removed it. MBC is like the most watched network in Arab world. And so they removed that. And from here on, MBS with big entertainment, they think that by creating big music shows and festivals and opening up Saudi Arabia to entertainment and openness, a very conservative society suddenly was switched into so-called openness, which is basically throwing big parties in the desert for the eyes of the West. Just to say to the West that we are partying like you. They start bringing artists that have been completely dead, no one have heard about for 30 years, and giving them live shows and gigs in Saudi Arabia. And so Warner Music Group came in the same moment and opened up an office in Beirut and is starting luring those alternative artists for signed contracts. And a lot of them did. What it does is basically you can go to YouTube and watch the show on Vice Arabia. It's sponsored by Durex.
Yep.
It's a type of show that featured in the beginning Warner Music Group artists. It's a type of show that is created to actually dumb down the Arab intellect. It's a show that is so sleazy that it's bringing all these Arab rappers, and what it's trying to do is it's forcing these Arab male rappers to actually express a sensitive and sensual aspect of themselves and so on. We are again superimposing the whitewashing of rap in America on the Arab world one more time. Because why an Arab man needs to go on TV and speak about his sensuality and as a rapper in a very sensitive way. And they are paying big money for that. I've heard they're paying $20,000 for an artist to just pop up and talk
about condoms.
Talk about condoms. Speak about themselves under a Durex banner. And it's also the culture of hyper-individualism that they are trying to promote. As I said before, we are a collectivist culture. And to be a narcissist and an individualist in our culture is something that is really rejected from people. Like when in Arabic, someone say "ana," say "a'udhu billah min kilmat ana," because when someone says "I," he has to say, I have to be wary about that, and so on. And so now there is this medium to promote individual identities that are liberal, Arab, and desirable in the eyes of the West. And so in this way, all the Arab youth get magnetized to this new openness, to this new big music and festivals and the lure of big entertainment companies, to forget about Palestine. On WMG's website, when they opened in the Middle East in 2018, they mentioned all the countries except Palestine. And that's what made me think, like, the removal of Palestine from the music map is not innocent. It's not a slip of a pen, like they say. It's on purpose. It's about the removal of Palestine from our conscience as Arab youth. And it's about playing on this idea that, politics, it's so corrupt, it's so boring, we don't understand it anymore, we just want to listen to music, we just want to be hedonist, we just want to live, we love life, like a lot of Lebanese liberals say. But all this is to say, stay away from politics, stay away from the resistance, Palestine, it's so complicated, blah, blah, blah. It's all about disinformation. It's all about misleading the new Arab youth who have witnessed the last 10 years, who have saw the violence that came after the uprisings, and who, in a sense, have grown up on an atrocious diet of social media and individualism on social media and so on. But, luckily, these situations, these cases only exist in certain social bubbles. On the street, the word is very different. On the street, you don't hear what is being spoken on social media and so on.
Right. No, exactly. And then, I wanted to also, I'd be remiss not to ask you about this. You've been back and forth between Beirut and London for the last few years. So you've seen the deterioration of these very different countries, Lebanon as its economies collapsed, in the UK or England or Great Britain. I'm not really sure what is the correct way to refer to I get confused by that.
But it's UK for now.
Okay, UK for now. So whatever the hell they're calling themselves, as it goes through, like Brexit and the collapse of the Jeremy Corbyn left, and now, the collapse of Boris Johnson. So I'm curious about that experience. You've had this kind of front row seat to the collapse of a former colony and a former colonizer. And if you have any comments to make about those two things.
Well, I can speak from a personal experience. That when I first came to London, shortly after Brexit happened, and I was here when it happened. So I was concerned, obviously, about this big thing that was going on around me. And I remember when I was in a pub talking with someone, a stranger, and I was talking about Brexit, and he suddenly stopped and asked me, how come do you know about this so much? How long you've been here? And I told him I've been here for a few months. He said, how come do you know so much about it? And I'm like, I read the news. So the fact that I was a foreigner and knew a lot about their politics was a situation of suspicion. But I noticed after that whenever I introduced myself as Mohamad-Ali, there was a reaction in people's faces that I still registered, especially white people. Someone told me once, you don't look like a Muhammad, and it hit me because I don't know how a Muhammad looks like. So I asked her, I was like, how does a Muhammad look like? She said, you don't look like a Muhammad. And so you see this weird racist encounters here in England. And so in my opinion, it's really sad, the situation here, because it's such a classist society. There are food banks, and you find a lot of people lining up on food banks. At the same time, you see restaurants are full, and we are hearing, and actually people are preparing that by the end of this year, by the beginning of winter, a lot of people have to choose between food or heating. and that's brutal. That's really sad in such a rich country, such a massively rich country, and a country that actually exploited the rest of the world and made their riches because of exploiting the rest of the world, not of genius and so on. And so, yes, it saddens me to see that happening here because I come from Lebanon and I grew up in a civil war. I grew up in the 90s, and Lebanon was what it is today. The stability that collapsed, the fake stability that collapsed in 2019, it was maintained on a very fake equilibrium. But the true Lebanon that it is today, a failing state, a brutally failing state, is the Lebanon we know. And so when I come from Lebanon and see things in here resembling things there, it feels sad, and in a sense, and it feels like times are changing and the empire is collapsing and it's ending in a very brutal way. And it's actually a good time to be alive and witness everything going on around us.
Yeah, it's a historic moment. Well, Mohamad-Ali, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for your articles, which again, I will link to in the description. Is there anything else you'd like to plug or shout out? Where can people follow your work? These kinds of things.
I just say that it's an exciting time to be alive, and there's so much to learn and talk and speak about. And hopefully soon we'll be able to, I'm about to publish a novel in August, and it's about the return of Palestinians to Palestine. And so hopefully soon we'll be able to share that with you. Thank you for having me.
We'll have to have you back on to talk about that. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthrough news.